Welcome to this new lecture of Python on loops and iteration. So in our daily life, we have actions, we have events that require repetition. So for instance, when you brush your teeth in the morning and the evening, when you eat cereals, or even if you are cooking and you prepare lasagna for which you need to add multiple layers of food in a repetitive manner. In programming, generally statements executed in a sequential manner. So first, the first lines of code is executed, followed by the second lines, and so on and so forth. However, there are many situations when you need to execute a block of code several times. So for instance, in geographic information systems, we may want to estimate the distance between origin and destination multiple times. Programming languages, be Python or C# or Java, provide various control structures that allow far more complicated execution paths. In this video, I will help you to understand what loops are and the different types of loops that we have. For loops, while loops, also nested loops, where you may have two for loops, one in one another, and so on, and also ways you can exit loops. And I will, of course, provide many illustrations throughout this video. All right, I think a good way to understand loops is to start with a simple example. Let's suppose for a second that I want to print my name 5 times. And so what I would do is basically put 5 statements, print Eric 5 times thus. And as we can see, that is not very efficient, especially if we want to do it multiple times, more than 5 times, also like 200 times or maybe 1,000,000 times. There is, however, another way to do it that is a little bit more intelligent and more elegant, would be to have one print statement, but that somehow you would find a procedure to repeat it. So we can really define, and this is really where loops come in, and we can define a loop as an instruction that repeats multiple times as long as some conditions are met. And this as long as would typically be captured by either a while loop or a for loop. Before we dive into for loops, while loop, and nested loops, let's look at the basic mechanism of a loop. So typically we have a starting solution here where we start in our code. This is our flow, and we come across a condition. Now, if this condition is true, then I am going to execute a particular statement. Okay, and then I continue and I go back and I'm going to check on this condition, and if this condition is true again, I will repeat and repeat and repeat. And I will repeat this as many times as the condition is valid. Now, once this condition is not met, then that's false, and then you essentially exit this your loop here. The first type of loop that we're going to talk about are while loop. While loop essentially will repeat a section of a code an unknown number of times until a condition is met. Typically the syntax is as follows. We have a while keyword here, followed by an expression, where this is where we're going to check for the condition, whether the condition is met or not. And then we are going to execute a statement or multiple statement. In the example that I took earlier when I was trying to print my name 5 times, this is how this would translate into a while loop. First, I would initialize a variable equal to 0. You could start at 1 as well. And you would say, while n is less than 5, print Eric. And then I would increment that variable n by a unit of 1. Let's see now about the for loop, how the same process translates to. We are now moving into the for loops. For loops are used to iterate over a sequence, which could be a list, an array, or a string. The syntax is as follows. It's not more complicated than a while, except that you now have really 2 keywords for a counter in a sequence, perform or execute statement. So what that counter is, the counter is nothing else than a variable. Oftentimes we use index I. You could use j, you could use whatever you want, but I is typically what is used. And that variables will keep track of where you are in your sequence. Now, what is a sequence? The sequence could be, as I mentioned, a list, an array, or string. Oftentimes we may use something using the keywords, the function range, which will provide a list of numbers with a starting point, an end point, and an increment. So in the example that I've provided earlier about printing your name 5 times, this is how you would write it. For I, so I against the counter, in range 0 starting, and 5 with an increment of 1, print the name Eric. So I could have also used, as I was doing in the while loop, a variable called n, m, j, whatever I wanted. Again, that really does not matter. It allows you to keep track of where you are. Range 0, 5, 1, that would be the numbers 0, 1, 2, 3, and 4, because it doesn't go all the way to the end. We'll do some exercise and that will become, of course, much more evident. Okay, now I'm turning my attention to nested loops. Nested loops are nothing else than loops within loops. They can have different types. You can have for loops within for loops. You can have while loops within while loops. You can have a for loop within a while loop and a while loop within a for loop. And it's not uncommon to have the second group, by the way. Remember that for loops and while loops perform very different things. I'd like to take an example to try to illustrate these nested loops. I have here 2 groups of points. The first group here, A and B, group 1. The second group here, 1, 2, and 3, group 2. And I have listed those actually as a list. When would that be useful? That, for instance, we want to know the distance that separates this first group, which may be the origin, to the second group, which may be the destination. So this is something quite common in geographic information system when you do network analysis, for instance. And so I like to know the distance. I can call a distance function that I could have defined earlier, which would be really useful. But the way I would set it up is as a nested for loops. And so I would basically say for each element in group 1, so that would be for A and B, and for each element in group 2, I'd like you to calculate the distance. So how does that actually work? Now, the first thing that you will notice is that we do not have here an increment at the end, because in the for loop that is done automatically. In a while loop, you do need to specify that. So I would start for I in group 1. So the first element would be A. So that would be my first element. It doesn't print this on the screen, but it's just so you can follow. And then I would also take the first element in group 2, and that would be 1. Now, that would be my first pair. And from there, I would then calculate the distance between A and 1, right here. So then when this is done, I go back here, and I will increment J. So that's done. That's taken care of by the for loop. And now I would have A and 2. And I would measure the distance between A and 2, and I would report it as well. Then what happens next? I go back here, and it will be A and 3. Okay? And there again, I will then measure the distance, and that would be reported. Now, I'm done here, as you can see. So I go back up here, and then I go to the second element, and that would be B. And then I go to the first element, 1, and then so on and so forth, B2 and B3. Okay, you understand the mechanism. And so that's really an example where nested loop become very useful. Our last topic is on break. So break essentially allow you to get out of a certain flow that is typical of for loops or while loops. Okay. Typically what happens is when you use break, you're going to transfer the control to the statement that occurs right after that the loop, as long as a certain condition occurs. So let's take a simple example here where I have some text and write, hi there, hey there, how are you? But I would like to only print the first statement, which would be hey there. So I notice that there is a dot here. And if my objective is to print every letter, okay, and to stop once there is a particular character here, the dot, then I would essentially use an if statement that would check if I've reached that that dot here, and if I do, then I break out of the loop. So here we have x is the variable, this is the string, right? And you have this character there. I say for each element, so for each letter here in this string sequence, so H, E, Y, and so on, if I is equal to this particular character, then break out of the loop, and then as you can see, there is nothing at the end anymore, so basically the code will stop. But in fact, if that condition is not met, then it goes and print and so on. Okay, so I will show now a few examples to better understand the mechanism of for loops, while loops, nested loops, as well as the break statement.
Okay, I'm going to show a few examples on for loops, while loops, nested loops, and break statement. Our first plan here is to print your first name 5 times on the screen. So that is the example I've shown in the video. In a for loops, you can request the name through an input function, and then you're going to print it for I in range from 0 to 5 with an increment of 1. So this is a range function, very important. Print name. I'll see what happens. So enter your name, Eric, and as you can see, the name is entered 5 times on the screen. Let's move on into the while loop. So here, same thing, input the enter name, but here the difference is that I need to initialize the value of n here. That will keep track of how many times I'm going to print this on the screen. Now in a for loop, this is done, the initialization in the for loop is done here, by setting up to 0, and the termination rule is there. Here the termination rule in the while loop is set up right up here. So we can run this one and see what happened. Name Eric, and it actually printed more than 5 times. Seems to be an infinite loop. So this is interesting. Why do you think is an infinite loop? Because we forgot to here increment n, and so otherwise n always remains 0. So now let's run this again, and we see that this is printed 5 times. Okay, so what I was showing you before, that was an infinite loop. Okay, I'm moving on to nested loops here. I like to print each adjective for every fruit. We have 3 adjectives: red, big, and tasty, and we also have fruits: apple, banana, cherry. We're going to use 2 for loops. We could also use while loops, but 4 is good here. And we're going to print every combination. Okay, so we can see what happened here. Every combination of adjective and fruits is listed here on the screen. All right, finally, I'm going to show you a little bit about the break statement. So let's say we have, we want to write a program that can display all the elements before the number 88. So here I have 4 number in, and so this is a list, right? And I have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 elements. And we are going to print the number but then we test after we print the number. So we print 11, and then we're going to test is that number 88. If it is, then we're going to stop the algorithm. So he's going to do 11, he's going to do 9, and he's going to go to 88. He's going to print 88, but then he's going to check, is it 88? If it's the case, then it use break, and it will get out, and the number 10, 93, and 19 will never be printed on the screen. We can check. If I was to move 88 a little bit further, as you will see here, for instance, that solution would then be different, of course, and it will print a greater amount of numbers actually.